Major approaches to history of modern India, looking at how histories are written in the past is part of the study of intellectual history or the period under discussion and can provide a variety of ideas and explanations. The starting point in the history of the society therefore has to be a familiarity with its historiography, the study of historical interpretation. This provides recognition of the intellectual context of history instead of seeing history as just a narration of events. The modern history of India, for the convenience of understanding, can be read broadly under four approaches: the colonial or the imperialist, nationalist, Marxist, and subaltern, each with its own distinct characteristics and modes of interpretation. However, there are other approaches: communalist, Cambridge, liberal, and neoliberal, and feminist interpretations, which have also influenced historical writings on modern India. First being the colonial approach or imperialist approach. For the major part of 19th century, the colonial school occupied high position in India. The term colonial approach has been used in two senses. One relates to the history of colonial countries, while the other refers to the works which were influenced by colonial ideology of domination. It is in the second sense that most historians today write about the colonial historiography. In fact, the practice of writing about colonial countries by the colonial officials was related to the desire for domination and justification of colonial rule. Hence, in most historical works, there was criticism of indigenous society and culture. Simultaneously, there was praise for Western culture and values and glorifications of the individuals who established the colonial empires. The histories of India, written by James Mill, Mount Stuart, Elphinstone, Vincent Smith, and many others, are pertinent examples of the colonial historiographical trend. Certain characteristics common to most of the works of these historians are the following. First being Orientalist representation of India, the opinion that the British brought unity to India, the notion of social Darwinism, the English considered themselves superior to the natives and the fittest to rule, India viewed as a stagnant society which required guidance from the British, that is the white man's burden, and last being the establishing Pax Britannica to bring law and order and peace to a bickering society. And second being nationalist approach. The nationalist approach to the Indian history can be described as one which tends to contribute to the growth of nationalist feelings and to unify people in the face of religious, caste, or linguistic differences or class differentiation. This approach looks at the national movement as the movement of Indian people, which grew out of the growing awareness among all people of the exploitative nature of colonial rule. This approach developed as a response to and in confrontation with the colonial approach. It should be noted that the nationalist historians of modern India didn't exist before 1947. Before 1947, nationalist historiography mainly dealt with the ancient and medieval periods of Indian history. However, in the last quarter of the 19th century, a detailed and scientific critique of colonialism for the adverse economic aspects of alien rule was developed by nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji, N.G. Ranade, G.V. Joshi, R.C. Dutt, K.T. Telang, G.K. Gokhale, D.E. Vacha. The only accounts of nationalist movement was by nationalist leaders, not historians such as R.G. Pradhan, A.C. Majumdar, J.L. Nehru, and Pattabhi Sitaramaiah. R.C. Majumdar and Tharachand are noted nationalist historians of modern India. Marxist approach. The third being the Marxist approach. The beginning of Marxist approach in India was heralded by two classical books, Rajni Palme Dutt's India Today and A.R. Desai's Social Background of Indian Nationalism, originally written for the famous Left Book Club in England. India Today, first published in 1940 in England, was later published in India in 1947. A.R. Desai's Social Background of Indian Nationalism was first published in 1948. Unlike the imperialist colonial approach, the Marxist historians clearly see the primary contradiction between the interest of the colonial masters and subject people, as well as the process of nation in the making. Unlike the nationalists, they also take full note of the inner contradictions between the different sections of the people of the Indian society. However, some of them, particularly Rajni Palme Dutt, were unable to fully integrate their treatment of the primary anti-imperialist contradictions and the secondary inner contradictions and tended to counterbalance the anti-imperial struggle with the class or social struggle. They tend to see the national movement as a structured bourgeois movement, if not the bourgeois movement, and miss its open-ended and all-class character. Another noted Marxist historian who made a critique of R.P. Dutt's paradigm is Sumit Sarkar. He considered Dutt's paradigm as a simplistic version of Marxian class approach. He looks at the nationalist leaders in the light of intelligentsia, which acts as a kind of power, a proxy for as yet passive social forces and with which it had little organic connections. A.R. Desai traces the growth of national movement in 5 phases, each phase based on a particular social classes which supported and sustained it. And next being the subaltern approach. This school of thought began early in 1980s under the editorship of Ranajit Guha as a critique of existing historiography, which was faulted for ignoring the voice of the people. Right from the beginning, subaltern historiography took the position that the entire tradition of Indian historiography had an elitist bias. For the subaltern historians, the basic contradiction in Indian society is the colonial epoch was between the elite, both Indian and foreign, on the one hand, and the subaltern groups on the other, and not between colonial and the Indian people. However, they did not subscribe to the Marxist theory of the nature of exploitation by the nationalist movement. They point out that the Indian society of the time could not be seen in terms of class alone, as capitalism in the country was just nascent at the time. This school sees nationalism as exploitative in terms of caste, gender, religious, and creed divisions. Nationalism say the subalterns ignore the internal contradictions within the society as well as what marginalized represented or had to say. They believe that the Indian people were never united in a common anti-imperialist struggle, that there were no such entity as the Indian national movement. Instead, they assert there were 2 distinct movements or streams, the real anti-imperial stream of subaltern and the bogus national movement of the elite. The elite stream, led by the official leadership of the Indian National Congress, were little more than a cloak for a struggle for power among the elite. Next being Criminalist approach. The historians of the school, relying completely on the colonial approach of medieval India and colonial era textbooks, viewed Hindus and Muslims as permanent hostile groups whose interests were mutually different and antagonistic to each other. This view was not only reflected in writing of the historians, but also took a more virulent form in the hands of communal political leaders. In their view, India's medieval history was one long story of Hindu-Muslim conflict. As a corollary of this view, it was then argued that the 19th and 20th century Muslims had the happy and proud, ever-present memory of having been ruling class, while Hindus had the sad and humiliating memory of having been the subject race. This ultimately developed mutual hatred among these groups, often resulting in communal riots, and in end led to the partition of India. Cambridge School. According to this school of thought, the fundamental contradictions under the colonial rule was not between the imperialism and the Indian people, but among the Indian themselves. Further, Indian nationalism was not the product of struggle of the Indian people against the colonial exploitation, but what arose from the conflict among the Indians for getting the benefits given to them by the British rulers. The leaders of the national movement, according to this school, were inspired by the quest for power and material benefit. This approach has been criticized by many scholars on the ground that it takes the mind or ideals out of the human behavior and reduces nationalism to animal politics. Liberal and neoliberal interpretations. According to this interpretation, the economic exploitations of the colonies was not beneficial to the British people as a whole. The availability of markets for British industrial goods in colonial world and capital investments in overseas markets, like laying of railways in India, might have actually discouraged domestic investments and delayed the development of the new industries in Britain. The proponents of this school of thought are Patrick O'Brien, Hopkins, and Kane. Feminist historiography. The shift in terms of writing of women history began with the women's movement of 1970, which provided the context and impetus for emergence of women's studies in India. Very soon, women's history broadened and assumed the more complex shape of gender history. In the early years, the endeavor was to write a history of women to supplement the writings of mainstream history. Also, an attempt was made to research and compile an archive of women's writing. An important era of research has been analyzing of the way in which colonial structures such as legal structure affected women's life. Women's vulnerability due to denial of ownership of productive resources has been focused on. In analysis of how progressive laws shape gender relations in colonial period, 2 works based upon women's question in India, The High Caste Hindu Woman 1887 by Pandita Ramabai, The Mother India 1927 by Catherine Mayo attracted international attention. Summary. Different approaches. Colonial approach is influenced by the colonial ideology of domination. It focused on criticism of indigenous society and culture and praises the Western culture and values. James Mill, Vincent Smith, etc. follow this approach. Next being the nationalist approach, evolved as a response to and in confrontations with the colonial approach before independence. This school dealt with the ancient and medieval periods of Indian history and not the modern period. After independence, this school focused on modern India. R.C. Majumdar, Tarachand belonged to this school. Marxist approach focuses on primary contradictions between the interests of the colonial masters and native subjects. It also takes notice of the inner contradictions between the different sections of the Indian society. R.P. Dutt and A.R. Desai were noted Marxist historians of India. Subaltern approach takes the position that the entire tradition of Indian historiography as an elitist base and role of the common masses has been neglected. Ranajit Guha belonged to this school. Communalist approach views Hindus and Muslims as permanently hostile groups whose interests are mutually different and antagonistic to each other. Next comes the Cambridge School. Envisages Indian nationalism as a product of conflict among Indians themselves for getting the benefit of the British rulers. For them, Indian nationalist leaders were inspired by greed of power and material benefits. Liberal and neoliberal interpretations implies that the economic exploitation of the colonies was not beneficial to the people of Britain as it delayed the development of new industries in Britain. Feminist historiography focuses on areas of research and analyze colonial structures such as legal structures which affect women's life. It also focuses on women's vulnerability due to denial of ownership of productive resources.